Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Testing 1, 2, 3. Mumble, mumble, mumble. Stop it or you'll go blind. Before into this session, I just wanted to say something briefly about being patron of IPAN, which I'm assured doesn't mean I'm required to be patronising. How would anyone not want to be associated with an organisation whose goal is an independent, peaceful and sustainable Australia, free to make our own policy in the interest of current and all future generations of Australians, and recognising our debt to the first Australians. And I join with our chair in acknowledging that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Acknowledging the traditional owners has become a bit of a ritual, and even LNP politicians now usually remember to do it. But it should be much more than a ritual, because the first Australians worked out over tens of thousands of years how to live within the limits of the natural systems of this harsh and unforgiving continent. And they embodied those knowings, not just in custom and practice, not just in ceremony and song and dance, but in their system of laws, the system of laws that allowed them to live sustainably. And I'd suggest that we whitefellas really need to learn from that example. We have no prospect as a civilization, not much prospect even as a species, unless we recognise the need to live within the limits of natural systems and embody those requirements in a system of laws so that we actually require people to live sustainably. And as this conference acknowledges, we are at a critical point in human history. We face two existential threats, either of which could lead to the end of civilization and possibly the extinction of this species, the accelerating impacts of climate change and loss of biodiversity and collapse of ecological systems, and the threat of nuclear war. And warfare has always been a very primitive way of resolving our differences. And it didn't do any permanent harm while the blokes were just waving spears and sticks and clubs. But now that they've got their hands on nuclear weapons, sleepwalking into war is potentially catastrophic, because a war between nuclear-armed states would almost inevitably end up in the use of nuclear weapons, and we know that at best that probably means the end of civilization. At worst it means the extinction of us as a species. So we really are beholden, I think, not to be sleepwalking into war, but to acknowledge our responsibility for creating the future. I spent a year running our Commission for the Future, and its motto was, the future is not somewhere we're going, it's something we are creating. There are a wide range of possible futures, and the whole point of an organisation like IPAN is that the futures we are creating should be sustainable, they should be independent, they should be peaceful, they should be just, they should recognise our responsibility to act as if we intend to be permanent inhabitants of the planet rather than temporary visitors with a licence to loot, rape and pillage. So IPAN is about what one of my friends calls the Goya principle. If you want a better future, you have to Goya. It's an acronym, it stands for get off your ass. I have a little postcard at home from a visit to France, and it says with typical Gallic hubris, "Nous ferons changer le monde," we're going to change the world. And underneath it says in fine print, words in French that translate as, "If it's not you, my little one, who will begin to change the world? Who will do it?" If we want a better world, we really have to be working purposefully for it, and working thoughtfully, cooperatively and effectively with groups with a common purpose. And we talked yesterday about the need to work with Indigenous people who have suffered at first hand the nuclear testing that Bob Menzies allowed the British to conduct on our soil, and have very actively, effectively opposed uranium mining at Jabiluka and attempts to impose radioactive waste disposal on their lands. So we really need to work effectively with them. And a final commercial, there are copies around of the People's Inquiry. I acknowledge in the back Chad, who was one of the other authors. get hold of this report, use it like the Club of the Righteous, because it's all about questioning our involvement in the US-led wars and the nuclear fuel cycle. Okay, enough. What I'm supposed to be talking about. If I can make this go down. Sorry. Oh, right. Sorry. Okay. Fundamental point, the military are very significant contributors to climate change because they use prodigious amounts of fossil fuel. The US military, for example, their fuel use, even when they're not fighting wars, is comparable with a small country like Denmark. That's the US military just sitting there preparing to unleash their weapons on other people. And of course, once they start fighting, they consume enormous quantities of fuel. During the Iraq War, for example, about 3/4 of the fuel the American military used was the fuel used to ferry supplies and weapons to the troops who are actually fighting. The military and warfare have all sorts of other impacts on the environment. Habitat destruction, deforestation was a political tactic used in the war in Vietnam to make it more difficult for the North Vietnamese to supply their troops. Pollution of air and water on a huge scale in warfare. You only have to look at the footage coming out of Gaza or Lebanon or the Ukraine to see what is being done to the air and water by the military activities in those places. Since the military discovered that depleted uranium was heavier than lead and therefore useful for weapons, depleted uranium has been used on a huge scale, and the result is depleted uranium being left lying around everywhere where wars are being fought. And of course, hovering over us all is the risk of nuclear impacts. The strategists now talk glibly about mega deaths as if it were acceptable to threaten to murder millions of people. If you think about it, if a hostage threatens to kill 10 people, we call that terrorism and we arrest them and lock them up. If a military strategist threatens to murder hundreds of millions, which is what having nuclear weapons targeted on cities is, we call it strategy. And it really should be treated as what it is. It is terrorism on a prodigious scale. And those who are doing it really need psychiatric help. And they should be under treatment rather than receiving knighthoods and other honours. Radioactive waste is a continuing problem. Western Australia now actually has a commercial site that has been treating toxic waste and is now licensed to manage low-level waste from this state. But in the rest of Australia, the Commonwealth Government has made 3 unsuccessful attempts to impose a low-level waste repository on unwilling communities. And in every case, actually, it has been the opposition by Indigenous people that has been crucial in stopping those attempts by the Commonwealth Government. But I've pointed out that this decide and defend model hasn't worked anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world where a government decides to impose a radioactive waste repository on a local community, the local community has opposed it. The local community has much more skin in the game than the centralised government, and in every case, the local community has fought it off. So everywhere in the world, radioactive waste is piling up while governments kick the can down the road and leave it to the next term of office for somebody to figure out what to do. Now, low-level waste is comparatively benign, and that problem is in principle soluble, because if it's buried under a few metres of earth, the radiation at the surface is not much worse than background. And it's a consequence of the good uses of radioactivity for medical imaging and for treatment of cancers, from which we all benefit. I have personally benefited from some of that largesse in recent years as an ageing male. So I accept that it's a good thing that radioactive isotopes are being produced, but as a consequence, we have a responsibility to manage the waste. There's a larger problem with Lucas Heights producing intermediate level waste when the spent fuel is reprocessed in France and sent back. So far that's just being stockpiled at Lucas Heights, and that's a temporary solution, but we have to permanently manage that intermediate level waste. It has to be stored away from the biosphere for thousands of years, and we have to have an adult conversation about how we manage that waste. There are two much worse clouds on the horizon. Mr. Dutton's meat-headed proposal to build nuclear power stations is, as I said to somebody, it's legally impossible, it's technically improbable, it's economically irrational, it's environmentally disastrous, it's socially unacceptable, but otherwise it's a very good policy. The fundamental point is that even if he were to be elected, and even if he were somehow to manage to sweep away the Howard government's prohibition of nuclear power and the separate legal prohibitions in all the eastern mainland states and the not legally binding but politically solid opposition in the other two mainland states, and even if he were to go ahead and build 7 nuclear power stations, and even if they were, unlike all recent experience, actually to be built within 15 years, they would still only provide about 5% of our electricity demand. So basically, the proposal to build nuclear power stations is really a smokescreen to conceal the fact that what they really want to do is to keep burning coal. Because even if they were to go ahead and build nuclear power stations, they would have to keep burning coal for at least 25 years. So it's entirely inconsistent with our responsibilities under the Climate Change Convention. Final atrocity is AUKUS. And of course, there are other very serious problems with AUKUS. Professor Hugh White, who wrote the 2009 Defence White Paper, has pointed out that nuclear submarines are about as useful as a chocolate teapot in defence terms, because any conceivable military threat to Australia would come from the north. But nuclear submarines cannot operate in the shallow coastal waters around the north. They're very good at defending us from penguins if they ever mount an assault from Antarctica. But basically they're part of colluding with the United States to put pressure on China and threaten warfare in the Taiwan Straits. So it makes no sense in defence terms. It makes no sense in economic terms to spend $370 billion on something that is fundamentally useless. But the most serious problem is that in the fine print of the AUKUS agreement, it says that we will manage the waste from the reactors at the end of their useful life. The US and the UK have been running nuclear submarines for more than 50 years and have not yet figured out what to do with the waste at the end of the useful life. The used reactors are just sitting on dock sides while they scratch their head trying to work out what to do with them. So we have volunteered to solve a problem that neither the Americans, nor the Brits, nor the French, nor the Russians, nor the Chinese have worked out over 50 years. Well, it's good that government has faith in our technical capacity, but it's really ridiculous. So we should be saying as a community, AUKUS is a pile of crock. It's rubbish, it makes no military sense, it makes no defence sense, it makes no economic sense, it makes no environmental sense, and it's putting an intolerable burden on all future generations. So we should be working as a community to confine AUKUS to the rubbish bin of political history. Thank you very much.